Welcome everyone. Today we are joined by Judge Thapar, who serves on the 6th Circuit of the Court of Appeals in the United States. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So you're here in Australia talking about your new book, The People's Justice. Your book focuses particularly on originalism and an originalist approach to interpretation. Could you maybe explain what originalism is and maybe what some of the other types of interpretation are as well?
Yeah, so the idea behind originalism is to interpret the law consistent with the text as it was understood at the time it was passed. And the reason for that is when people pass a law, they have certain things they're trying to accomplish, and those things are reflected in the words of the law they pass. And so it's a judge's job to interpret the law and rule according to law rather than their personal preferences. And that's really at its core what originalism stands for. It believes in trusting in our case, the American people to pass the laws and be responsible for the governance of the country, and for judges to defer to that by interpreting the law consistent with the people's wishes. And that is reflected in the text. That's the only way we can figure that out. Other philosophies tend to do, instead, James Madison only said we were going to be a country governed by law, not by men's individual wishes or women's individual wishes. And the idea behind originalism is to honor that. And if you govern by your own wishes, you change what is a republic, our republic, into a dictatorship of judges.
Thank you. So this one's a bit of a niche Australian question. So in Australia we have this movie called The Castle, which tells the story, I don't know, are you familiar with The Castle?
I've heard a little bit about it.
Well, it tells the story of the Kerrigan family's battle to save their home or their castle from compulsory acquisition by the government.
Was it really a castle?
Well, they would argue that it was. It's based on a true story as well. And the airport was actually expanding and they wanted to take their home. So they took their case to court and they actually won. The real story, they weren't so successful, but in the movie they won their case. Your book tells a similar sort of situation with perhaps a less fortunate outcome, but it nonetheless illustrates how originalism benefits the little guy over, big government, big corporation. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on the Kelo case?
Yes. So one of the principal criticisms of originalism is that it favors the rich over the poor, the strong over the weak, the corporation over the consumer, and the government over the individual, when exactly in most instances the opposite is true. And the idea behind the book is to show that through 12 cases, show how originalism was designed to honor the will of the people. And when the American people set up their government, they gave the federal government limited power over their lives and retained everything else to them. One of the things they did do is in the Fifth Amendment, they said to the Constitution, they said the government can take your property for a public use with just compensation. So the first chapter in the book talks about the case of Suzette Kelo. And Suzette Kelo is this remarkable woman. And she was down on her luck. She was having a falling out with her husband after her 5 boys she had raised and they had left, and she was a paramedic. And her dream was to have a house with a view of the water. But as we all know, if you don't make a lot of money, you can't afford a house with a beautiful view of the water. But what she did find is in the Fort Trumbull neighborhood of New London, Connecticut, she found a rundown house. And the chapter tells the story in what I think are gripping details, but I'm just going to give you the short version, which is still long. And she gets this house. And she buys it even though it's completely run down, so run down the real estate agent is embarrassed to sell it to her, but she buys it. And in order to fix it up, she knows that she needs to do a lot herself and she needs to get another job. And so she enrolls in what are called correspondence courses. Do you have those in Australia? Where you don't have to show up at college, but you can take the classes online.
Yeah.
And so she enrolls in correspondence courses to become a nurse. At the same time, she rolls up her sleeves and through blood, sweat, and tears starts to fix her house. And there were cracks in the walls, cracks in the ceilings, cracks in the sidewalk, weeds growing everywhere. It was completely run down. And she does it. And she also graduates and becomes a nurse. And so through blood, sweat, and tears, she turns the house into her dream home with a back patio looking out over the Thames River. And so she's got a view of the water. She's got a house in this beautiful blue-collar neighborhood in Fort Trumbull in New London, Connecticut. The name of the neighborhood's Fort Trumbull. And it's a blue-collar neighborhood, but a good old-fashioned blue-collar neighborhood that America was built on. Well, New London decides in an old Navy mill site, down the road next to the Navy Yard, they want to bring in a Fortune 100 company. And they find the perfect partner in the Pfizer Corporation. And the Pfizer Corporation wants to develop their wonder drug, Viagra. But Pfizer will not come in and just rehab the mill site and put their labs there. They want more. And they say, in order for us to come, we want the following. We want a high-rise condo building where our executives can live with a view of the water. We want a nice hotel. We want fitness clubs and Lululemons and a beautiful outdoor mall. We want it all. And we want a park. And the mill site is down the street from this beautiful Fort Trumbull neighborhood, this blue-collar neighborhood. Well, New London and Pfizer determined that they're going to have to take the neighborhood. And so they proceed to take it through eminent domain. Now, here's the thing. They weren't taking it for a public use. They were taking it to benefit the Pfizer Corporation. And this was remarkable. And so Suzette and her neighbors, the Dairies who lived next door to her, had been there 100 years. They loved the neighborhood so much, when their kids got married, they put a down payment on a house in the neighborhood for them. Well, they weren't going to take this line down, and they were going to fight it. And fight it they did, but the city would not back down. And so it went all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, Suzette's lawyers, the Institute for Justice, knew they had a problem in the Supreme Court. The reason is, when the court was not so originalist, they changed the words of the Fifth Amendment. There was a case called Berman out of the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. And in Berman, the city council decided that they wanted to take the most interracial neighborhood, wipe it out, because they said part of it was blighted, and turn it over to private developers who could build nice, beautiful condos, and it would increase the tax base, and they said it would help make the area, city safer. And so they took these buildings from this poor neighborhood, and they took all these people's houses. And that case went to the Supreme Court, and in that case in the 1950s, the Supreme Court said, because they were taking it for a public purpose, that was all right. Now notice the change in words. This Fifth Amendment says public use. What that means is they'll take a sliver of your land to widen a road. They'll take a small portion of your land to put in a sidewalk, something the public would use. In the most extreme circumstances, they'll take all your land to put in a railroad. But again, it's something the public would use. That was the original meaning of the Fifth Amendment. Well, the Supreme Court said public purpose was enough. Well, public purpose can be very broad. So Suzette's case gets to the Supreme Court. And Justice Scalia asked the city's lawyer, if it's public purpose, can you take from A, who's poor, and give to B, who's rich, because the rich person will pay more taxes? And the lawyer says yes. And Justice Scalia can't believe it. He asks again, and the lawyer says yes. So in any event, this case gets decided, and it gets decided 5-4. And Suzette loses. Justice Thomas writes one of the two principal dissents, and in his dissent, he advocates for going back to the original meaning of the Constitution, because he says that eminent domain, the process of taking people's property, has historically been used when misguided, to prey on poor and minority neighborhoods. And he proves it through statistics. He points to Baltimore, he points to Minneapolis, he points to the Washington, D.C. case. He points out that 97% of the people displaced as a result of eminent domain in Washington, D.C. were black. And he points out that if we went back to the original meaning of the Constitution, it would protect those who don't have the political power to protect themselves. Because most of our poor and minority citizens who are, if they're poor and minority or poor and white, they don't have political clout. And so they can't stop the city from taking their property, the indignity of losing their home. And Justice Thomas has this great quote where he says, something has gone seriously awry with the Constitution when though the American people are safe in their houses themselves are not safe. And it's amazing. The worst part of the story is Pfizer then comes in, develops their drug, Viagra. It doesn't turn out like they think. Suzette's neighborhood gets wiped out. I went there. Pfizer left 8 years after they came, and today Suzette's neighborhood is a barren field that is inhabited by feral cats, rubble, and weeds.
Yikes, that's devastating. In your book, the pictures halfway through with the Odessa pink house was beautiful, and it's a real shame that it's no longer there.
Yeah, and did you see the field? I also went and took a picture of the field.
The before and after, it's quite a stark contrast.
Yeah.
A bit of a shift in gears. So one of the, I guess, key principles of the rule of law is that it is accessible and known, and that it's made in an open and transparent way by the people. Do you believe that the concept of a living and active constitution undermines the rule of law?
I do, and I think that because the people can't know what a judge is thinking. And so what you can do is figure out what the law meant, what the language means. What you can't figure out is what a judge is going to say are the evolving standards of decency. So in this case, Living Constitution, to go back to the Kelo case, changed the Constitution's words from public use to public purpose. Right? But who did that serve? Not the individuals, but the cities, the governments, the corporations. And so, but you can't predict if that's what the court's going to do. If they say evolving standards require the government to have more power and the individual to have less, that's not the deal the people signed when they agreed to the Constitution. And so I think it's really important. The beauty of the text and understanding that the text of the law governs us, is the law that governs us, is that everyone's given a fair chance to try and interpret that law.